is that you allow for the fragility and the vulnerability in her as a character, and also this real fortitude and strength. And sometimes it's very quiet, sometimes it's a little bit louder throughout the season. And I was interested in how you, when you were first approaching building her as a character for yourself, how you found the spaces in which that could always coexist within her.
A very good, complex question. Well, I think in a way it's sort of what you were saying is sort of what The Crown is always trying to do, right? It's always, which has been a really interesting conversation in the UK recently about fact, fiction, reality, whatever. And so it's sort of what we've been saying now for a few weeks. What we're trying to do always is sort of really get into that crevice, that really sort of private, intimate place. And I think that's what Peter does so beautifully, and that's always what he's writing for us to do. So it was a really interesting process getting into that. I was doing press only recently for this here, and I found myself realizing that I had a lot of time because it was the pandemic, so I could sort of absorb and almost sort of by osmosis just spend a lot of time with her and try and understand what she was going through, and versus obviously the sort of public-facing mask that we all know. So,
you know, she's obviously going through the breakdown of her marriage and is in a space of extreme isolation and not really having people directly around her that she can share with easily. And there's different ways in which that expresses itself throughout the season. You know, again, sometimes it's the very quiet, introverted moments with herself and how she carries herself, and sometimes she's very outwardly expressive about her anger and her frustrations. And so how did you approach calibrating based on where she is in the season, where she is in her life, how you felt like she would be expressing these continued frustrations that she had at that point?
Well, I mean, that's sort of what I adored about playing her in this time period as well, because she starts off in this sort of, there's something sort of unformed at the core of her, and so much of the struggle that I found myself playing was of ownership of the self, you know, which is such an incredibly difficult thing to come across as a normal person. But if you're trying to sort of establish who you are at your core and find that authentically whilst being watched by the world, it's an exceptionally difficult thing to do. And so I feel like that's sort of what the journey is in this season of somebody who's incredibly raw, really, at the beginning, and then learns how to, or at least we watch her try to sort of grab a hold of the reins of the narrative of who she is. And there's always a duality, isn't there? There's sort of what she wants the world to know and believe about her, is just sort of have them on side, and then there's also the truth of who she is really at her core. And I think the thing with Diana is they often are the same thing, because what she is incredibly honest about herself. She always was so honest, you know, which takes an incredible amount of courage to be vulnerable and be honest and let people into that. So.
Absolutely, and obviously in working on a show like The Crown, there's an incredible amount of research that goes into it with Peter Morgan and his entire team. And I've heard that when they were asking about what research you wanted, your answer was everything. And given how much there is because of the time period in terms of video footage and photographs and interviews that you could look at for reference, how did you then take the research that they had accumulated and distill down what are the pieces that are going to be really useful to me in finding both who she is as a character emotionally, and then even just the physicality of that as well?
Well, we do have this amazing research department, and the lady who runs it, her name's Annie, and I had a Zoom with Annie. I was in Australia, and Annie said, "What do you want?" And I said, "Give me everything," which I immediately regretted, because I'm someone who loves to do my homework. And then I opened up this little archive, and I was like, "Oh my God, Jesus Christ!" But I had this time because it was the pandemic, and so that was a really interesting process, because I think driven by fear, by this sort of great, juicy fear that definitely ebbed me along in the beginning of the process. I thought, well, I'm just going to jump in as deep as I can. But of course, then that sort of was incredibly overwhelming, because you think, how can you know a life? How do I get as close to the truth of things as possible? And I found myself watching a lot. I read a lot, but that was really interesting too, because I would get, I kind of knew I was starting to get close to something, because I would I'd get a quarter of the way through the book, and then I find myself sitting on the couch and thinking, how dare you? I mean, you know, that's not true. It's so defensive, and then I think, who wrote this? So then I throw that book away. I became like absolutely livid. I think, well, how do you know that's what she was thinking? How, you know? And so I read and I watched, but the things that I started to love were that, you know, I realized I was sort of hunting for footage and things written that somehow didn't have an agenda. I wanted the rawest things. I also wanted to try, I mean, because it's interesting with these characters, because they are so public facing, they understand how to manipulate. So you're kind of always looking and you're hunting for the things that, it's almost like where they're not aware, that split second, you know, or where something surprising might happen and the mask drops. And so I was hunting around for a lot of sort of unedited sort of newsreel footage, you know, that the BBC had of them getting out of a car when they went to Korea, and you know, it was some terribly distressing, sad trip, and you see them just sort of sitting in the car before they know that someone's photographing them, and you look at their body language and you think, oh, that's interesting, and that's something I can hook into. But I had to spend enough time with it that it soaked in somehow, that I wasn't thinking when it came time to do it. And I think the same thing with the dialect, which I spent a lot of time doing. And you know, and it's so funny. I was in Australia, and I was doing these Zoom calls with my dialect coach. He's a genius, and he has done all of these voices and created, you know, and we have these ridiculous practice sentences that we walk around saying things about Fuzzy Wuzzy was a bear. This is how I made off. Where did it come from? And we walk around. It's so, you know, and then everyone in your family's washing the dishes going, Fuzzy Wuzzy was a bear. And it's mad, and you sort of just become completely obsessed with everything. But my poor sister, she'd be in the shower and she'd be doing these terrible, you know, she'd go, God damn it, Elizabeth, I was doing Diana's voice all the time. But I sort of knew that there was this huge surplus that was available, and so I had to let the things that were going to stick, I just had to let them stick, and then the other stuff was always going to fall away, you know. But you're not in control of that, so yeah.
I also wanted to ask about working with Polly Bennett, who's the movement coach on the show as well, and what were some of the aspects that you found yourself just naturally determining about the physicality and the movement of this character for you, and then where did she really step in and helping you to figure out some of the details, whether they were larger pieces or some of the more nuanced elements?
Well, I've never had a movement coach before, and what I loved about it was that I had this captive person who had to have the conversation with me. So if I wanted to talk about the certain tilt of her head for an hour, you know, she had to do it. Which I loved. Because that's the sort of thing as an actor that I've always just sort of been, you know, you just do it on your sofa and you feel like you're going kind of mad. But so suddenly there was this amazing person there, and I guess it's interesting when you do these characters, because what you want to be able to give the audience is the satisfaction of recognition of something that we all sort of kind of is somehow enmeshed in our cultural consciousness, how these people sound, how they look, how they occupy space. And I mean, working with her was fantastic because we all have a map, a blueprint in our body, and the way we move is a response to that, you know, our psychology, our experiences, and so she kind of helped me understand the map. And because I think when you play Diana, everyone goes and does this thing with their neck and this thing with their arm, and so it's so funny. You go, yes, there's that, but you know, and it's honestly everybody does it. Like the burly painter who comes to your house, oh, you're playing Diana, and he goes. Right, thanks, Jim, that's great.
There's also a lot of delicacy and specific calibration, even just in the volume of delivery in your voice. You know, at the beginning when they're on vacation, she's very outwardly frustrated, so that's obviously a much louder conversation. And then I think about, you know, I think it was episode 9 where it's Diana and Charles and they're having a conversation, and then it's almost a whisper by the time she's saying, well, William's the one that people want to see as king more now. And so she's able to deliver something that feels very acerbic in a very, very soft manner. And so how did you find those sorts of calibrations and scenes? Would you have an idea going in, or was a lot of that discovery in the moment?
I think it's sort of discovery in the moment, but I also think maybe it's so interesting when you have these conversations, because I've never thought about that before, but I guess she grows up a lot in the course of those 6 years, and I think that fight that we watch in episode 1 it's a young fight in a way. It's a kind of, I wouldn't say adolescent, but there's a kind of knee-jerk, it's an unthinking kind of fight, but it's only 6 years, but I think within that 6 years, that character sort of, she has to grow up so hard and fast because of all the things that are coming at her. So, but I don't really know. I'm not often thinking when I'm doing things like that, so I wouldn't know. But I guess that scene in episode 9 is just such a brutally sad fight. It sits in a different place in the body, probably. Yeah.
And so much of this season is about her finding her way back to her central core and kind of refinding that relationship with herself, refinding her voice in new ways. And did you have an idea of what the end goal was, of this is where I want her to get to as a person? Or was it, as you went scene by scene, you started to kind of almost discover where you felt her center was going to land?
Probably a little bit of both, but I think it's really fascinating doing a TV show like this, because I've not really done anything like this before, where I really got given this incredible part, and kind of the joy of doing TV is that you have so much time inside these people, but it also is this experience of you just sort of, someone sort of lets you out of the gate and you're just going and you're going and you're going and you're going, and there's a lot that becomes quite unconscious, and you just come to work each day and this person sort of keeps coming out of you. And I think it was probably more something I understood in retrospect, but it's very clear to me now that I was constructing it. It's also to do with what Peter was writing for her, but I had someone say to me, what do you think? What do you think, if you had to sort of sum it up, this is about, this story of her? And I sort of found myself thinking, well, I think it's about somebody knowing that there is something inside them that nobody could touch, and getting back into contact with that thing, and that is that source of strength, and it's sort of the most precious thing we have, but we can lose touch with that. And I think that what happens to this person, and we see it with how Emma played her, and it sort of gets ripped out of her hands so early in her life, when it's so incredibly young. Like, how can you even know it's there? But through the course of this, I think that's what I was finding while I was playing her.
And there's insecurities that come to the surface from moments where she's in the car and then her brakes aren't working, and who could have possibly done this, being very aware of, I think people are listening on the phone, hearing clicks, and I almost don't even want to call it paranoia, because it was warranted on her part. And so what did that open up in her emotional landscape for you, in knowing that if that's her day to day, every time she picks up the phone to call her son, someone could be listening, this could be a story in the papers tomorrow?
I mean, it's a devastating kind of part of her, because she was right, and we know, history tells us that she was right about it. And I think this happens to people in these positions where they're not believed, and in fact their instincts are completely accurate. I think what it does is that she's already in an extremely vulnerable place, and it just completely destabilizes her. If you don't feel like your most intimate space is safe, then it really sort of starts to dismantle your capacity to grasp reality, but also, I think, your capacity to understand who you can trust. And so much of this story for her in season 5 is a story of watching her sort of lose a grip on something, because she doesn't know who she can trust. And I think that if you're in a position where you're so watched, you need allies, and she didn't have them, and I think that's what's so tragic.
And I mean, on the other side of her as a character, I love that we get such an exploration of her sense of humor and the lightness that exists. I love the scene where she first shows up and is sitting with Muhammad Al-Fayed, and they just have 5 in-jokes with one another within about 2 minutes. And what did that open up in the way that you viewed her, and the way that you were able to play her, and always being able to go to that side as well?
Well, for me, it was a joy. I used to joke all the time after doing some terribly sad crying scene. I'd say, God, trying to turn the Crown into a comedy one scene at a time. And I'd say to my director, can't you have the hiccups in this scene or say anything? No, and so I was always looking for these moments, right? Because when I started to do that research, and I also spoke to quite a lot of people, strangely, I realized I knew quite a lot of people who had been very close to her. And the thing that I always heard people say, and I almost felt like it was vital to the people who knew her to get across this, that she had an incredibly tragic life in so many ways, but her vitality and her humor and her joy were so vivid. And you just, as soon as people start talking about you hear like, well, I was doing this speech and I got up and she was sitting next to me the entire time, she was pinching my bum and she just thought that was glorious, and you think, I love that person, I just love that person. And it was really important to me as much as I could to thread that through, whether it's with the boys or, because I think there's something so childlike in the best way, that she still had that sense of play, which is remarkable considering how difficult everything was. So.
Absolutely. Well, we have a couple of questions again that were submitted to us beforehand, and then if we have time, we'll take some in the room. The first one is from Corey Andrews, which you were touching upon this a little bit before, but given the pressure actors often feel to deliver their strongest and most believable performances, did you feel even more added pressure portraying Princess Diana? And if yes, how did you prepare to play such an iconic and beloved public figure?
I definitely felt a tremendous amount of pressure. In a funny way, it was almost separate to the pressure to do good acting. The pressure to do good acting is always a thing, but it was more about a responsibility, a totally unique feeling of a responsibility to do something justice. It's kind of not quite tangible. It's hard to express, but it is a sense of. I know we all felt it. We've all spoken about it a lot. This sense of just being as honest inside of these people as we could be. So, but then of course the research was also sort of a duality. There's this sense of archival researching and part of that getting as close to that person and being as honest and gleaning as much information as you can, and then just the sort of layers of technicality that go into playing something like this.
The next one is from David Nemitz, who's talking about episode 9, obviously the phenomenal scene that we were discussing before. Episode 9 has the great extended scene between Diana and Charles at Kensington and takes an honest look at their broken marriage. Could you talk about what went into shooting that scene?
Well, it's an amazing scene. It's a really long scene, and Dom and I started calling it our one-act play. We didn't see each other very much on set because the stories they don't intertwine really until that point in the season. And every time I'd see him in the trailer, the sad car park where our trailers were, I'd say, when are we doing that play? I don't know, in December. So it was like this thing on the horizon all the time. And then we had this beautiful luxury of rehearsing it. And then we had 3 days to shoot it, which is also really unusual. And we moved through different sets to get these little moments in. It was also an entire day spent making an omelette. I'm not exaggerating. An entire day spent making an omelette, and I think there's 40 seconds of it in the scene. And this is a true story, it was the day that Peter came to set, and he got so grumpy, he said, "Are you going to make that omelette all day?" And we were like, "Yes." And then he splashed. I don't know, it was just the scheduling. But I think I made 42 omelettes or something. And I don't know, I wonder if that was almost a kind of, we were so relaxed after making the omelette 40 times that when we sat down at the kitchen table, there was always, I also loved that when we entered into this scene that we knew inevitably was going to descend into this really painful place, we were always laughing still about the scrambled eggs. So it has this beautiful movement through it, and for me, it's the kind of material that you really want. It's the kind of material that feels like a gift because you just get to explore so much in the scene. And I love doing it, and I loved working with Dom. I think he's an incredible actor, and he absolutely broke my heart. And that was the day he gave me a compliment. It was a big day for me. And he went, "Yes, you're brilliant." I went, "Oh, a compliment." I adored it, and I think, as happens often on The Crown, the material that I was doing is heavy, and it takes you to a really deeply sad place. But there's also a sort of part of your actor's brain that is just having the most amazing time because you get to do this territory and you get to do it with these amazing people. And yeah, that was definitely one of the, I'm like crying, there's all this snot pouring down my face, and then this little actor's antenna like pokes up and goes, God, this is so good. This is so much fun. And then go back into the scene, yeah.
And then there's more omelets.
And then there's more omelets and more snot, always.
And it's such an incredible scene. I believe we'll have the microphones come around again. We should have time for one or two quick questions. Yeah, right over there.
Hi, I'm Corey Murray. I'm curious because in watching this, and knowing Diana's life, I always thought, wow, Will and Harry lost their mother so young. But in watching, I wonder, has your empathy changed for what she really lost? Because me personally, I'm like, wow, she really lost who she was even before she was a mother. So I wonder, what do you think people should be most empathetic for in playing, now that you've played Diana?
I mean, there's sort of multi-layers to that answer, but I think in a kind of simple way, what I've learned in playing her is how the media was incredibly destructive in her life. And I think that shocked me, the extent to which it manipulated, and in many ways she's the symbol of invasion, in a way, of the paparazzi, of the chasers, and we know that she's emblematic of that. But the actual sort of slow destruction of trust, of understanding, of public rapport, of the consequences of being separated from the family, the loss of security, all that slow sort of degradation was devastating for me to learn. In a way, I couldn't believe when I was learning this that by the end of her life, she was just out on the street by herself. You just think, how was that possible? She was so vulnerable, and I think it sort of forced her to kind of move toward things that would protect her, and that's a specific kind of set and people, and so I think that was one of the things. But I think the other thing that, and I hope this is what the show can show as well, is that despite how difficult things were for her, the strength that she possessed and the courage to sort of continue, it's sort of unfathomable to me that you would be sort of broken down by so many things, and yet you would still possess the generosity of spirit to reach to people and give them the thing that you're not getting from anywhere. When we think of her, we think of this woman who is capable of giving people so much love. And also the thing that she was able to do is to see people, really sort of see people. And of course the tragedy was that nobody really ever saw her really for who she was, in a way. They saw construction, and by the end they saw what they wanted to see as a result of really how the British media was sort of deciding one day to the next who they would support, who they wanted to throw under the bus. And I think that was, kind of, that's part of the tragedy of it.
I have to say, especially having grown up in the UK around this time, it's absolutely phenomenal to see what you've captured in your portrayal of her. So congratulations on an incredible season. Thank you so much for sharing this with us, and thank you so much to all of you as well for coming.